All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 17th, 1844, Nelson Hackett begins his flight north from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Hackett was escaping his enslaver, who was following him in hot pursuit. According to reports at the time, quote, Hackett traveled only at night, hiding through the day in the woods, subsisting on such fare as the desert afforded. Upon reaching the Missouri River, he luckily found the ferry to be tended by a Negro, of whom it was believed he made a confidant, and that same man subsequently denied all knowledge of the fugitives passing that way. And so we're getting a hint here of the network that carried Nelson Hackett northward, and he would eventually find his way through Ohio and Michigan, and then ultimately he would reach Canada, which is a big part of the story. But that's one of the reasons we're discussing Nelson Hackett today, because he doesn't just escape to Canada, he gets sent back to the United States. The Canadian government collaborates, returns Hackett to sit in a jail in Detroit, and ultimately be returned to Arkansas and enslavement. So here to discuss the role that Canada played for people escaping slavery and this incident in which they collaborated, the first and last, are, as always, Nicole Heimer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
Kellie, we haven't done a proper Underground Railroad episode, and I don't know if this exactly fits into that, but maybe that's the context here of these both formalized but ad hoc stops along the way for people escaping enslavement. You want to just paint a little picture of what that's like and what that comes down to have someone like Hackett make his way from Arkansas all the way up to Canada?
Oh man, there's an intense network that really thrives and succeeds off secrecy. So no one was sharing the exact routes of where they were going or how they were getting there or names of who helped them. But that's what contributed to a lot of its success. People knew that there were certain people that they could trust that would help them either get on a boat or get to a safe house and get all the way to Canada. So before you get even to the fugitive slave law, Canada really is the only safe haven for a lot of fugitive slaves because they could count on the Canadian government not to return them. But this case is really so exceptional because it's the first time that it happens, but it's also the last time that it's happened. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, Black people can be assured that if you can get to Canada, you can pretty much get to freedom.
And Canada had been a North Star for a long time, right? It was a place where enslaved people escaped during the Revolutionary War, right? That if they could make it to the British Empire, they could escape enslavement. And so it had long been this place where free Black people could settle, knowing that they were out of reach of the United States.
Yeah. Obviously the Canada element is a big part of this, and we'll get to that. But in terms of Nelson's escape from Arkansas, I mean, it's not just safe houses and so forth, but there's little parts of the country that are little pockets of abolitionism. And Missouri City, Missouri is like a place where get to Missouri City and then they'll help you get to the next place and they'll help you get to the next place. And there's a ferry, as that article that I referenced said, there's a ferry driver who's sympathetic and will help you get across this. But, it's really just an understanding or a kind of learning as along the way of where are the safe spots and where can we get to that border.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we realize how difficult it is to do that, though. I mean, if you think about the fact of going from Arkansas to Canada, like pretty much in the middle of the country all the way to the top of the country and beyond, it is no small feat. And these are trips that would take months on end. This is not just a weekend or a few weeks. This would take months on end. And sometimes you might be stuck in a particular location for a week or 2 or weeks until it was safe to leave. Or sometimes you had to wait until the season was right or until rivers froze solid. So it's, timing there's a very strategic way of leaving that all enslaved people had to consider the weather, the season, and what they might encounter along the way.
And then, as I said, his enslaver is in hot pursuit, and that's a big part of this story too, because I mean, Kellie, maybe you can talk about this, but it's like, it doesn't seem, to put it callously, it doesn't seem when you read the scope of this story, to be honest, like worth it in whatever way for people to be so focused on tracking Hackett down, this one individual down, and getting him back to Arkansas. I mean, there's just an incredible amount of resources that are going into pursuing and then eventually returning this man.
Yeah. But I mean, if you think about the economic institution of slavery, it kind of makes sense in that enslaved property, they were worth so much. They were capital, they were cash. So if you had $1,000 just walk away and they don't leave you, you would be in hot pursuit of that $1,000, especially if, you only had a few enslaved people, which most people did. They had maybe 10, 5, 12, less than 20 people, but it represented all of their wealth, all of their assets. And so lots of time and money was spent into retrieving their human property.
Because, of course, it wasn't just about that one enslaved person. It wasn't just about that $1,000 that walked away. It was a message to the rest of the enslaved people that if you try to escape, we will go to the ends of the earth. We will spend whatever money it takes in order to get you back. And so it's a warning to everyone else that you better not try to escape.
Yeah. So what happens when he finally crosses over into Canada? What does life look like normally for someone who reaches that? What is thought of as a safe haven, and why does it not work out that way for Hackett?
I mean, it's kind of sad because even when a lot of enslaved people got to Canada, it was still really hard living. Now, they would still prefer, hard living as opposed to slavery, but it was not easy for a lot of people. And when he gets caught and, the Canadian government normally would have said, no, Hackett can stay here. But because his owner had accused him of theft, they said, well, this is a matter of a crime. This is not just an escaped slave. We have to address this because it also has the added factor of theft. And so they wound up returning him to his former owner. And it's pretty rough for Hackett the moment he's captured until he gets back to his former slaveholder.
It's an extraordinary story of what happens, though, because, he escapes to this community called Chatham, where there were all of these free Black people. It was kind of a Black Mecca in Canada. His enslaver finds him, beats him. He's transferred, bound and gagged to a jail in Detroit. And there, abolitionists and the free Black population of Detroit, they sound the alarms. They're like, there is a person who escaped slavery who is in this jail and we have to rescue them. And so they form basically like this freedom mob in order to try to break him out and bring him back to freedom. But they don't make it in time. And so he's jailed into the spring, and then he's shipped back down to Arkansas. He escapes once more on his way there, but then he runs into a farmer who turns him in, and he is greeted with a pretty awful fate when he makes his way back to his enslaver.
Yeah, it's brutal. I mean, one, the farmer turns him in for a reward. The other thing, there's an economic incentive to return people. And once he's returned, I mean, he's beaten brutally, violently, and done in front of the other enslaved people on the plantation. And that goes back to what NIki was saying, like the message that's being sent is, if you run away, this violence, this beating is what will await you if you do this too. Some records say that the first initial whipping was 150 lashes on his naked body. And then afterwards, a number between, 40 and 50, upwards of 60 lashings after that. It's amazing that he even survived this. But he does. And not only do they re-enslave him, but they ship him further south to Texas.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned, NIki, which is sort of fascinating, this idea of a freedom mob, as you put it. I mean, if you paint the picture of a mob of people gathering around a jail to try and pull someone out, so often that's how lynchings start, and that's how racial violence starts. And the idea here that there's a mob there to try and pull someone out, break someone out of jail to protect them and save them is just a really fascinating inversion.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder, Kellie, you can speak to this, that violence on behalf of freedom looks very different, and we respond to it very differently than violence, in order to uphold the racial and racist order.
Yeah, there's violence to perpetuate violence, and then there is violence to suppress violence. And that's really what this was. Most of it is, I would say, force as opposed to violence. It's not as though people are being, physically beaten up or harmed or killed. They're simply using their force to rescue this enslaved person. And in some instances, in a lot of instances, they're successful in doing this. They do this in Syracuse. They do this in Boston, in which they would, groups of people would find out where the person was being held, and they would just have a battering ram and knock down the door of the jail cell and free the person who was being captured. And in the case of Hackett, they were just too late. And so it's also a matter of timing for Hackett. It's just so unfortunate what happens to him, or I should say what's not able to happen for him.
Yeah.
So, Kellie, you would say there's a link between force and freedom?
There you go.
Doing the plug for the book, I love it.
I'm just trying to help you out here.
Yes, if you want to know more, Force and Freedom is an excellent read about Black abolitionists and the politics of violence. Have to throw that out there.
As we wrap up, Canada and their stance in all of this. We've said a number of times this was the first and the last time that sort of Canada collaborated in this way. The Canadian government sent someone back. But what ends up being Canada's stance in the wake of this, and how does that affect the rise of the Underground Railroad and the plight of fugitive slaves for the next little stretch?
So Canada basically says no more. Like, we're not going to do this anymore. They get pressured by inside and outside forces to no longer return escaped slaves to the United States. And so Hackett really becomes, it's unfortunate that he is this precedent, but he's the last person ever to be sent back to the United States for slavery. Canada refuses. And Britain had outlawed slavery since 1834. So it made sense that they would, uphold freedom within its territories for those who were seeking, shelter.
Because it became very clear in the case of Hackett that Canada was about to be co-opted into the system of enslavement in the United States. All somebody had to do was say, oh, well, this person stole from me, something that was often a trumped-up charge in order to bring law enforcement in and issues of enslavement. And they would constantly being called on by the United States and by enslavers to return free Black people in Canada to slavery in the United States, and abolitionists made sure that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. It does seem as if Hackett's fate himself, is a little unknown, where he ended up. I know you mentioned that there was that's right, he may have been in Texas, but really, like a lot of these stories, they're just lost, and no one is, it's almost a miracle that his story was sort of covered at all. But certainly his after his return to Arkansas. It's a little tough to figure out.
What I think is so incredible, too, though, is that even though he gets returned to Fayetteville, he tries to escape again. He's not, I mean, you would think after that violent beating and all of the consequences that he faced, prison, that he would sort of accept his fate, but he does not. He is relentless in his pursuit of freedom, and I think that says a lot about how awful and horrific the institution of slavery was, that even though you could face all of these things, you would still try to leave that space, that place. And so, yeah, I'm just sort of like, I don't know, struck by Hackett's relentlessness.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are drawn to that, and I would say maybe his fate is lost a little bit, though who knows. We've talked about on the show a number of sometimes these stories, it takes 150 years to find out, to uncover some of the details. But there does seem to be an effort to tell his story a little bit more, including we should give a shout out to a podcast from the public radio station in Arkansas. KUAF did an interesting series about Hackett that we'll link to. And then there has been a push just in this last year or so to put a marker in downtown Fayetteville for Hackett. The Bank of Fayetteville apparently sits on the right near where a grocery store that Hackett's enslaver owned and Hackett worked at. And next time you're in Fayetteville, hopefully that plaque will be up and you can tell us about it.
I would love to see that.
Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.